Hello, and welcome to Idea to IPO. I'm Jason Putnam Gordon, an emerging growth and venture capital attorney with K&L Gates LLP. This is a health tech panel focused on the latest in innovation and investment in health tech. We've got a great panel for you. We've got Gary Goldman from the Global Health Impact Network. We've got Ephraim Lindenbaum from Advanced Ventures and Alex Santos from Chamaeleon. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a moment. But before I do, I want to give you a little bit of information about how today's program will run. So the panelists will speak for about an hour. It'll be a discussion amongst themselves, semi-moderated by me, trying to make sure everybody sort of has an equal amount of time and nothing comes to fisticuffs at the end of this. During this conversation, it's recorded. So please don't share any confidential information with us. It's going to be preserved. Additionally, I'm running the tech. So if you see me looking away or you see me sort of focused on something else, it's not because the panelists aren't interesting. They absolutely are. But I'm probably making sure that something is happening so that you have a seamless and good experience. I will also tell you if I drop off, I know from experience that both F and Gary, and I'm sure Alex, can continue the conversation without me. Please take a moment to fill out the audience survey. We'd love to know who is here today. It's very helpful to direct our conversation. If you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A function. The chat function will not be monitored today. And with that in mind, I'll give you one more admonishment to fill out that survey. And then I'll let Gary Goldman tell you a little bit about himself, a little bit about his fund, and a little bit about, what's a good fit for him and his fund. And then we'll move around the horn. Gary?
Thank you. Appreciate it, Jason. Good to see everybody, by the way. A little bit is always hard for Gary, but I'll do my best. So I've been in healthcare for 35 years. I have lots of different titles after my name, which just means I spent a lot of time in school. I was a dentist. I'm a physician informaticist for an enterprise level hospital system for about 10 years for EHR implementation, and a serial entrepreneur. And about 4 years ago, it became quite apparent to me in my schlepping around the country as a consultant that most of my colleagues were disenfranchised, unhappy with electronic healthcare records, not exactly loving the direction in which digital health was taking medicine. And my response was always, well, if you aren't involved, why don't you get involved? Why don't you become an investor, become an advisor, become a consultant, become an innovator? And the response I always got across the board was, well, how do I do that? I'm so busy. I'm busy with my practice. I don't know where to go. So that's when the light bulb went off in my too much energy head and said, okay, no more new companies, because I probably would get a divorce anyway from my wife. So why don't we start a network and a venture fund which gave clinicians, not just physicians, but clinicians, the opportunity to actively participate in the digital health revolution. When was the last time that Kleiner Perkins knocked on my front door and said, I've got the next Google in healthcare, would you like to invest as a physician? Never. So I said, give them an opportunity to invest, but also give them an opportunity to participate in the due diligence process. How do we pick the companies? How do we identify those early stage digital health companies that have a chance for being a 20x return elephant in the field? And to me, the only effective way, certainly from a clinical perspective, to accomplish that is taking the subject matter experts in those areas and having them look at it and say, yes, I would use this. This is something that makes my life easier, improves the patient-provider interface. So we get them involved as advisors, consultants, part of the due diligence process. But most importantly, we created, as you see behind me, Global Health Impact Network, which is a network of communities, which has created an ecosystem supporting portfolio companies and everything from early idea generation all the way through commercialization. And it's not just clinicians, it's expert like Ephraim and the entire group here. We have legal representation, we have IP representation. So what's there to support those companies when they start? And then most importantly, sales cycle, business development, marketing, and sales. We've got a global network of clinicians that are informaticists who can get us into the right places. So we've created that ecosystem. We're very open to have anyone who's interested in healthcare join us. And our sweet spot is digital health. So anything that falls under that huge category. Thanks.
Fantastic. We're delighted to have you back, Gary. Thanks for your time. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Jason. Hard to go after Gary there, I'll tell you that. So my name is Ephraim Lindenbaum. I'm the managing director of Advanced Ventures. We're an early stage venture fund investing in technology, health, and wellness here in Silicon Valley. And I started my career as an entrepreneur. It's pretty rare today in the venture space, but I started about the first third of my career building and growing a company here in Silicon Valley, raising capital, and ultimately finally an S1 to go public and getting acquired in the process. So I've kind of done all the different cycles that, you know, ideally startups do, and it brings a pretty unique perspective to us, both as investors, as board members, and really as cheerleaders for all of our companies. We've been investing now for about 20 years. It's almost 22 now in Silicon Valley. We've been really blessed or lucky to have an exit about every 14 months since the beginning of our fund. And, you know, fundamentally, we look for early stage companies that have a minimum viable product, that are already generating customer traction, whether that be beta customers, ideally paying customers. We typically look for fairly well-formed early teams. And we typically invest in syndicates in, you know, the first or second institutional round of a company's financing structure. You know, as it applies to digital health, you know, we've been involved in this category since the founding of our fund. As you can imagine, you know, this started on computers with green screens and, you know, moved on to mobility, mobile devices. And, you know, very much today, we're broadly spread across the category: diagnostics, software, mobility, all the different categories that roll up into, you know, broadly digital health. You know, we really view this today as very much, you know, sort of two categories. One would be what we would call brave new world. That's new tech. Oftentimes folks like Gary who have a vision, who are boots on the ground, can ideally, you know, spot that technology. Or we look for better, faster, cheaper. And, you know, given the state of the economy today, we see better, faster, cheaper as one of the key categories to invest in this area.
Well, makes sense. Great to have you back, F. And
Yeah.
Alex, welcome to the panel. We're delighted to have you here today. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much
Yeah.
for the invitation. I'm one of the co-founders and general partner at Chamaeleon. We are a brand new Silicon Valley early stage VC firm. And we also have offices in Europe where I'm currently based. One of the reasons why we have offices in Europe is a big part due to one of our distinctive elements in terms of value proposition as a firm. We're a quant-driven VC firm, so our data scientists, data engineers, and software engineers are actually here located in Europe. And basically what we do is we crunch a lot of data to look for signals to more proactively reach out to entrepreneurs out there. A lot of the meetings that we currently have are due to our proactive reach out based on the signals that we're looking at. We also provide data insights for the portfolio of companies that work with us, as well as data insights for our own investors and our advisory network. We believe that our advisory network is also quite special. I think any VC will say that, but we have a great pool of really senior C-level people in several verticals, from big tech to founders of great startups out there. A lot of them are also business angels. And one distinctive element of what we're doing with them is we're gamifying the whole relationship with them. So the ones that have higher engagement with us over time will get a higher return of what they're doing with us, because we're sharing part of our returns with them. And so that already led to several investments that we did that were shared by them as leads, and several co-investments as well. Because of our data-driven thesis, we're global and multi-vertical, but we have already invested in the current fund in 2 digital healthcare companies that I can talk a little bit more about later on. And it's great to be here, side by side with great experts in the digital healthcare space, and happy to be here and to learn with you guys as well.
We're delighted to have you here. And I've got a quick follow-up question for each of the panelists, which is, is there a preferred means of contact if there's an entrepreneur or someone who wants to reach out? Is there a best way to contact you? And if not, if you choose not to be contacted, that's okay. That's okay too.
LinkedIn is always great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Email Gary@globalhealthimpactfund.com.
Yeah, LinkedIn or email, and at Chamaeleon.vc.
Fantastic. So I'm Jason Putnam Gordon, emerging growth and venture capital attorney with K&L Gates. I work with startups, specifically those in the health tech space, medical devices, diagnostics, digital health. And my firm, K&L Gates, is a global, fully integrated firm with nearly 2,000 attorneys and 40 offices on 5 continents. I am also working on sort of a little side project to help entrepreneurs. So I'm just going to plug that and put that in the chat. But if you're interested in going to venture capital training camp and sort of breaking down how it is to grow and scale and raise that first round of preferred financing, at least from the legal perspective, feel free to check it out and give me some feedback. Let's see who's in the room real quick. So we've got 30% from the Bay Area and another 30% from the rest of the United States. We've got a strong European contingent of 20%, and then a few folks from elsewhere in the world. Again, this is recorded. We will follow up with an email afterwards with a recording. So maybe you're watching us on a time-shifted basis, and we're delighted to have you do that. In terms of who's in the room, strong contingent of first-time entrepreneurs, 30%, 21% serial entrepreneurs, some folks, about 20% in early-stage companies. We've actually got, maybe this is the highest result, but we've got about 13% in academia, and then a few folks who do something else. Great. Well, here we are at the tail end of 2022, Q4, believe it or not, and it's been quite a year. We started off this year off of maybe the largest, fastest, most bullish market ever in 2021. And here we are. I think, the summer was maybe a little bit slow. I feel like it sort of picked up again in the fall, Q3, about in September. But at least my observations are sort of late stage is down, sort of generally speaking. Those are companies who are generally, raising later rounds of capital, maybe their second, third, more likely third, fourth round of capital before exiting. The IPO market's a bit bumpy right now, but it seems to me that seed and early stage is still strong. I'd love to hear from the panel what they're seeing sort of generally and what you're seeing with respect to sort of health tech more specifically. Open question.
Yeah, so I mirror most of what you're saying, Jason. I think we're still seeing the later stage deals in the DEF, more like EFG, pre-IPO M&A still being funded, large check sizes going in, kind of staying behind those folks. I think the middle ground tends to be the most challenging right now. Companies that raised a fair amount of capital, may not have gotten the level of traction they hoped for, aren't generating or cash flowing at the level one had hoped by now, are really the ones having the hardest time. I think, early stage is still pretty ripe. Seed is always, somewhat speculative, so it does fairly well. But we are seeing a lot of pullback in the angel category. We are seeing in that, pre-institutional side, a fair amount of softening, right? I think discretionary investment capital from individuals or small family offices is certainly tightened up. On the institutional side, many of us, topped off our funds while the markets were still hot. And so there is a lot of dry powder in the venture category. I think, valuations are just coming back down to earth. There's a flight to quality, there's a flight to performance, and, being able to deliver on results promised.
I certainly would agree with everything that F said, which is not always common. we always like to mix it up a bit, but that's very true. And what we're seeing on the side, which is very interesting for us, our fund and our network capitalize across the board. We can almost syndicate our own deals to an extent. So we do very early stage, but then we do very late stage. And then we also, our management company does special purpose vehicles for companies that the fund isn't necessarily going to invest in or is quite early stage. And what we're finding in a risk averse way is investors, either individual angel investors as well as investors into funds, the more institutional, is that they're wanting to stay away from the sector of digital health, which has to do with platforms that are sold to HCOs, where the HCOs are suffering by the pandemic, they're suffering from the economy, they don't have a lot of extra money going around, and they're actually canceling a lot of contracts in platforms that might be looked at as efficiency platforms or improving revenue platforms or improving the clinician patient interface, because they don't have the luxury of having that liquid capital anymore. So we as a fund are staying away from those kind of companies. But then if you look at the companies that are device companies, where we already know that Medicare and a lot of the insurance companies are compensating for remote patient monitoring, there are now a lot of those entities that are focusing in on RPM in a way where they're working with practices, they're working with institutions to make it more efficient to capture those dollars and improve care by taking that data. So which kind of leads me to the next part, which is something that I've evolved into, and it just happens to be that the pandemic and the economy has driven us more in that direction, is when I look at companies now, it's very clear to me that the future of healthcare is data. And that's how we're going to improve care. We're going to initiate preventive care. We're going to become more focused on precision care, genomics, phenomics, the individual patient and how we care for them. And it's all based on the way, the passive way in which we can now collect data and then take that data and apply machine learning to it. So we're very focused on those areas in the long term from a venture capital perspective, because yes, they may have a device, but a device will get, it'll get replaced in a couple of years based on the advances of technology. But the data, if they're the first over to market to be collecting that data and utilizing that data appropriately, that's very valuable across the board, to HCOs, to startups, to platforms. So that's where we're focusing in.
And just to unpack that acronym, the HCO, you're talking about healthcare organizations, primarily sort of provider side, like hospital systems and et cetera. Is that right?
Yes,
okay,
thank you.
Great. Yeah.
Right. Maybe just to add a little bit to.
Yeah, please. I was about to ask. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was also said, but maybe a couple of pointers from my side. We focus mostly in seed and Series A stages. We're starting perhaps only in the last couple of months to see some slowdown and some founders saying that they just got board approvals to extend the rounds that they closed like 6 months ago or 8 months ago, and so you're starting to see maybe gradually some impact in the type of deals that we look at. But the devil is always in the details. You have sectors and verticals where are still quite strong. Cybersecurity, for example, is one. Insurtech seems to be also doing well. I would say that in general, we have a little bit more time to look at the deals, less hot deals out there where you have to decide quickly. And valuations, I believe, will tend to become more and more on the lower side over time. But it depends a little bit on the verticals. In healthcare, just before jumping on the call, I looked a little bit at our data sources, and it seems that from the peak in 2021, where more than 60 billion were invested in digital healthcare in general, and more than 3,000 deals were done. This year, the estimates for the year end will be around the 30 billion mark, so half of the money invested into digital healthcare in general, and less like 25% of deals, so smaller rounds as well. So later stage deals are drying up, and so you might have a little bit more early stage deals, but less deals in general, right? And so the median is going down as well, right? So that's why you have half of the money being invested and only 25% of drop in terms of number of deals.
Right. I mean, isn't that just to unpack that a little bit, especially for folks who don't necessarily follow the data or don't have access to the data.
Right.
I mean, especially when we're sort of talking about top line numbers in terms of the amount, the amount that's invested. A lot of that is skewed towards later stage deals, right? Because you could have a later stage deal, $100, $200 million. It takes a lot of $5-10 million rounds to be able to catch up to that. Is that right, Alex? Or F, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, that's why, most likely you're going to have only half of the money being invested this year in digital healthcare, but you still have like 2,500 deals versus a little bit more than 3,000 last year, right? Because you have several big deals that are not going to be closed, right? And that's putting the money in terms of funding, a lot lower than the number of deals being done, right?
Right. We also saw a rush to M&A here to, as the interest rates were starting to tick up, before, capital dried up on the debt side inside of large orgs. So, a number of different digital health deals were purchased, and, those I think, will tend to dry up at this point. And, I think the area that we're seeing, the most difficulty in terms of raising rounds is kind of in the middle, so to speak, right? Companies that have raised an A, maybe even a B, and are just, not performing at the level. I mean, it's very hard for an entrepreneur to be able to read the tea leaves. And, our experience in digital health is it takes much, much longer for adoption to happen than anybody likes to believe. That, oftentimes digital health entrepreneurs apply an IT metric to a health metric, right? Whereas, it's somewhere between biotech and IT, which is probably, 2x adoption cycle timelines of IT. And, I think one of the things that skewed that was, particularly, and Gary's on point with remote patient monitoring, telehealth, et cetera, the pandemic really, drove some flight to those out of, really need basis, right? So we saw some quick upticks there. And then as things have settled in, that adoption hasn't stuck at the level we like. It's certainly better than it has been in the past, but, that is really challenging. And, I think, to one of the earlier points, where insurance codes are paying for services, for procedures, for imaging, et cetera, I think we're generally okay. But, discretionary spending has really been limited. I think the decision making around adoption of a new piece of tech is really tough right now inside the systems, right? And I think where it's becoming even more challenging is digital health startups thought that they could penetrate the individual practice side. The small, medium practice, 1 to 5 clinicians, practicing in their own environment, being able to get in there and get some adoption. And, to be frank with you, I think during the pandemic, when options were limited, they were willing to try that. But now that, everybody's back into an in-office visit mode, we're seeing a lot of that pullback. It's much more of an out-of-pocket scenario that those clinicians have to have. And on top of that, they've seen, tremendous increase in other expenses within their practices. For example, general HR has gone up. Many of their other baseline expenses, including their malpractice insurance, has gone up dramatically here. And so, now the decisions are, do you pay your front office workers, or do you adopt a new piece of tech that may, give you a 5, 7, 10-year ROI, right? So it's become very challenging there. So I think when we start to look at these startups, we're saying, where are they entering the ecosystem? Who is their customer? How is that product delivered? And then pulling back and saying, okay, we see this segment being soft on the front end. And, I'd love Gary's feedback and Alex's as well as they view this.
Yeah, I think the other part too is, there's the investor part, right? Like who is investing, the angel investors versus who's investing in smaller venture funds like our clinical fund versus who is investing in the larger institutional models, and listening to the investors and hearing, the alteration or the shift in their desire to be to take risk versus being risk averse. And one of the reasons that I kind of left it out was that when I mentioned SPVs before, there was a reason. We were doing very well in the SPV market until the pandemic happened, and that market has been decimated. I mean, most investors are not willing to take that risk. We all know the statistics, right? In any company, if you're putting $1 into an early stage pre-seed startup, your chance of success is about 20%. When people were sitting on a lot of cash, they were willing to take that risk. But I can tell you that on the clinician side, and this is not a poor population, they're just not willing to take that risk. Whereas they're more willing now because of the volatility of the public markets to take that same dollar and put it into an area that they know, in a way that they know that vehicle in which they're investing, they have some input into it. They know it's their subject matter expertise area. They know what they're investing in, so they're more willing to. And on the institutional side, based on what F said and Alex said, it's not just into healthcare, but where in healthcare, right? And I think you hit the nail right on the head, F, when you talk about the shift that's happened because of where we were with the pandemic, which was not even close to over, but everyone else doesn't believe that. And wherever you go, no one's wearing a mask. And I just went to my first face-to-face annual physical visit in 3 years with my physician, and both of us were wearing a mask, but it was in the office, right? So when it made me think that when we start looking at these companies, we're no longer looking at those companies that were trying to capitalize on telehealth and just the current market, which is pouring everything into how can we do a completely pure telehealth optimized environment, to now, yes, telehealth is not going anywhere, but certainly the attention to it is weakening, because now we have to have more of a hybrid model where telehealth is appropriate and makes the practice of medicine more efficient. That makes sense. But where it doesn't, and there is face-to-face, now is face-to-face moving from an acute care to the point of care, right? How there's a big push now to not necessarily take care of patients directly in a hospital setting, but in a more ambulatory setting where you can leverage telehealth and extenders and bring in the clinicians when appropriate. So there's a lot of movement in the arena towards that direction, and we're focusing much more on those areas. And a lot of our investors are very interested in that now, because that really is the true future of healthcare, not where we've been forced into over the last 3 years because of the pandemic.
Alex, did you have any comments? Or I had sort of one comment and follow up, but I want to make sure that you had an opportunity to weigh in.
If we still look at the data this year, you still see a lot of investment into telehealth startups, and actually still into mental health startups. I was just browsing some of the numbers, and even with the drop in general, you see a lot of money still flowing into the trends that emerged from COVID still. But I tend to agree with Gary. Maybe the attention will now be a lot more into other things as the fads from COVID wane off, and people start trying to solve some of the underlying issues that we still have in healthcare. That is a lot related to the more you do outside of the hospitals, the better. The more you do in primary care or home-based models, the better, right? Versus, urgent care and other type of things, right? So, the data is still showing that a lot of people are still investing a lot into telemedicine in general and mental health as well.
So just sort of, I guess, one additional thing to sort of flesh out a little bit. I do think that at least with respect to telehealth, the pandemic, despite a lot of loss and suffering that it caused, the sort of silver lining was it did sort of change, it did enable it insofar as a huge shift in regulatory scheme and the ability to at least give it a shot and test it out, which I think that was holding back that particular sort of subvertical for years. Are we going to be able to do this? Are we going to be able to implement it with the regulator? And then the regulators basically had no choice. So people need to have healthcare. We got to figure out a way to solve this problem. Are there any other sort of trends that you think are sticking around post-pandemic or sort of through the tail of the pandemic, depending upon whatever your position is on the current state of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic changed a lot of elements. To Alex's point, I mean, mental health is very meaningful. To Gary's comment, diagnostics are very interesting as you get into genomics. I think there has been a push now into, informatics as it applies to longer term treatment courses and different treatment, models, and be able to look at outcomes there. Within particular categories, that's interesting. There's really a lot of jam ups that are still happening across the board, right? As we look at things like clinical trials, it's a real bloodbath out there getting participants in, getting things managed. The FDA is still backed up, so there's a lot of, sort of disruption currently getting sorted through. We also still have supply chain crises. And, at the end of the day, I think the labor shortage is probably top of mind in most healthcare systems today, right? So if you're walking in, with a new piece of software, or new piece of hardware that requires an SOP change, SOP, that's standard operating procedures, and you need to integrate that into a system, those are very challenging. Right now, it's hard to just staff organizations. It's really hard to, push the kind of volume that the insurance companies would like through there. We've heard stories from specialists that basically said, look, I don't want to even futz around with telehealth because, 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10, 5 out of 10 patients have a problem getting online. I can't hear them. I can't see them. It's a bust. I end up just calling them, is that still billable? I end up doing it twice. I want to ultimately see them. So there are a lot of issues. We've been investors in telehealth, since the mid-teens, and it's my great story. Is we sold our telehealth company 3 months before the pandemic. Probably left a ton of money on the table. Luckily, the private equity firm that bought it sold it again a year later, and we got another bite at the apple. So we probably equalized a bit there. But I think that's a good show of coming into the pandemic. A lot of people were really in a position where it was sort of a roll-up strategy, combine the pieces, try and centralize the spending on marketing and sales and everything else because of the slow growth curve. Mid-pandemic, it was, a bonanza. And I think we're going back to the second, the earlier phase, which is, can you keep the customers on board? I just heard earlier today, and I think Gary was mentioning it, and you as well, they're canceling contracts in the hospital systems. They're really lightening the load, on their expense side with anything that isn't revenue generating, time savings, labor savings, et cetera.
But let me ask about maybe another pandemic trend. And I think we might have sort of a biased answer because we have at least 2 funds that are focused on global investment, right? But one of the things that opened up, I think, in the pandemic was that the world became even flatter than it was before in terms of capital deployment and the ability of entrepreneurs to access the Bay Area, capital in the Bay Area, and vice versa, investors outside the Bay Area to access companies here. Do you see that trend continuing to persist? That is sort of a flat world of global capital, or is that starting to recede a little bit as well?
Well, I mean, in general, that's probably making sense. But when you get into healthcare, it does become a lot more segmented, right? One of the challenges, external investors, international investors coming in and investing in US companies, I think that trend will continue indefinitely. They've managed to get a toehold here. The downturn in venture is only creating more opportunity for them to invest, and that often is wise. But you've got a regulatory framework issue when you get into digital health, and Europe is still a patchwork in light of the war in Ukraine. Interests are elsewhere. You've got national hospital systems, socialized medicine. Trying to do business in the healthcare space in Europe is often very challenging. You've also got multiple languages. It is messy. We recommend to our early stage startups, don't even think about that until you're well deep and established in the United States, North Am, maybe Canadian to a degree, but that's even challenging in their medical system. Certainly places like the Middle East are great for trials. The Gulf is very innovative. The Israelis are always open to things. But beyond that, I think globally, the push is the United States. That's the test bed. You've got the most, opportunistic, position to be in here. So, we look at the international side with a lot of skepticism. It's more of a New York story. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, vis-a-vis, trying to be a regional player in a very patchwork oriented market.
I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to that. And I guess it's just a matter of perspective. Because of the nature of our network, we've gone in a bit of a different direction with our portfolio companies. It's because of the pandemic and because of the effects on clinical studies and being able to complete them on time and the timeline needing for FDA submission. A number of our companies actually were beginning to run out of cash because their projection for when they were going to get to the point of FDA approval. And by the way, the FDA is not exactly moving faster than a turtle either in terms of their turnarounds. So we've had to step in and a couple of cases do an SPV bridge round to a B, but they weren't ready for the B until they wanted to hear back from the FDA. And then my response has always been, or our response has always been, well, okay, I get it, but we're a global network here, and what you're doing can be deployed in places other than the FDA. We have some companies that have EU approval, but they don't have FDA. But the focus is to try to as F was saying, is dominate or at least work on the domestic market. But sometimes you've got to pivot, and we happen to have clinicians all over the globe in different hospital systems, in the Apollo healthcare system in India, and we have connections in Africa. And at some point, especially if you're looking to get to that next round of funding like an A or a B, you got to generate some revenue, especially in this market. You can't walk to the market and say, we have the best idea on earth, but we haven't made a penny, and we're not going to for the next 12 months. Because it's going to be very hard to raise capital, and even for us to justify to our investors why we put more money into this company. So we're pushing a lot of our companies, to start implementing their solutions in Hyderabad, which is very active in India, where you don't need FDA approval, and they are very digital health friendly in terms of advancing the market to improve their access, right? So for us, we're really pushing our companies to do more international commercialization. We're also seeing, I'm about to go to Abu Dhabi and Dubai in 2 weeks, and I got invited, out of nowhere, because it's turning out that in the Middle East, and we've got a couple of companies out of Israel, as F mentioned, there's a lot of great technology coming out of there, that they're very interested in entering into the healthcare market, especially the global healthcare market, because the Middle East and Saudi and the Emirates, they're all very interested in adopting these technologies, and they understand that a lot of it is being developed in other places. So we're finding for our new institutional fund that we've set it up to take international dollars, that we're getting a lot more exposure and interest internationally in places like that than we are locally. It's more of a fight for the dollar. So I think it's a balance. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish and then where you do it. But we definitely have to open up our eyes to the global market right now, given where the economy is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think India is a bright spot, and certainly there are particular categories within the digital health spectrum that you can apply in India. I mean, I think it's just economics, right? You've got to be able to operate, at a tenth of the respective revenue. The spend there is a tenth the spend here, if at best. And and I agree with Gary. I mean, there's some bright spots in the Gulf. There's a lot of innovation happening. They're willing to spend. But at the end of the day, I mean, my, advice to the startup is, really dig in where your market's there. Look, if you're based in Europe, that's great. Stay in your space, get your traction, prove your value, and then move on. But, in order to get to the big exit, you're gonna have to, go into the largest market out there. If you're gonna look at a public market exit, if you're gonna look, certainly if you're looking at M&A, that's got to happen here if it's going to happen at the scale you like. I mean, certainly M&A is happening in India, but you can just, shave a multiple of 10x off the number, right? So as a venture, how much can you, as an investor, how much can you, deploy into a company and hope to get the return structure you need in order to stay in the space? So, again, I totally agree with Gary and I'm sure Alex, because of your position there, you guys see a lot of that out there. When you're focused as we are at that exit, right? Someone's got to buy you, you've got to go public. In our mind, unless it's an optical issue of revenue, you just got to go with the US market. Every dollar you spend in marketing here is worth, multiple of that when you compare it to, multiple languages in multiple jurisdictions and multiple regulatory structures.
I totally agree. US alone represents more than half of the deals that are done in healthcare around the world, right? It's the biggest market by far, right? You can sum up Asia, Europe, and other regions, and it's still smaller than the US, right? In terms of size of the opportunity, in terms of healthcare, digital healthcare. That's why the two investments that we did so far were in US-based companies. We see a lot of deal flow in Europe. There are good companies also in India. I agree. Brazil is a good natural market as well, but it's really tough to crack the code there. You have Indonesia, that is a big market, and in Asia, each country has their own reality, right? And it's really tough to navigate. You have a couple of interesting markets in Europe, UK, Germany, France. Others are maybe too small, and then it's really hard to have a play that can drive their way from one country to another. I totally agree with that. And from an exit perspective and M&A perspective, it's the US, right? I totally agree with what you said.
And to follow up, I think one of the things that Jason brought up earlier, both in terms of regulatory clearance to utilize this new technology, also the payer side has really evolved in some of the new digital health areas in the US. And, when you're building a digital health startup and you're building a startup at all, it's incredibly difficult, right? And you want to eliminate as many obstacles as possible. And now that, it's a pretty straightforward process in the United States in terms of a payer code insurance pay model, right? It's private insurance for the most part, or it's government, Medicare, Medi-Cal, whatever the state-based systems are. The reimbursement rates are pretty well set. The process of achieving that's well set. What sort of milestones you have to hit in order to get paid for it. And, because clinicians and the medical industry, for the most part, doesn't actually pay for itself. And that's something I think it's really important for the entrepreneur to really understand, is like when you go to a hospital system, there are two sides. If you're providing a patient care or any type of a solution that's ultimately billed to a third party, insurance, private pay, government, et cetera, that's one bucket. If the internal healthcare hospital system must pay for that off its balance sheet, that's a whole different bucket. And so, when you're looking at a startup and you're saying, okay, I've got to go create this new piece of technology, diagnostics, any type of model, even into, different therapeutics, being able to say, okay, I understand how I'm going to get paid for this. So the delivery of care, becomes a less, a less challenging process, the more you're able to focus on the actual solution you're providing, right? And when you get into the different regulatory structure, to Alex's point, even the UK, which is, we're on the same, we're all speaking the same language, they've got a socialized health system. So their model of being able to get reimbursed is a whole different structure. And so therefore, it presents a model where, geez, you could spend a bunch of time as a startup just trying to get your codes over there, getting through the system. Where here it's like, okay, you've got a box, to Jason's point, there've been regulatory relief there. If you fit in the box, they're going to pay you X for that, televisit, mental health televisit, mental health visit, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got at least a, sort of a point on the board as an entrepreneur, say, okay, I'm going to get roundly X for delivering this care, this service. Now I can start to work backwards and figure out, what I can do and how I do it, and that, just, reducing the level of moving parts in a startup is, our number one focus and number one piece of advice for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that in that, and that kind of leads to two different points that lead to the same point, which is, especially in the early stage startups, and we see this all the time, all of us, there's not a clarity into who the customer is. Okay, that sometimes there'll be B2C and there'll be B2B, and it's not clear if it's the hospital system or is it only ambulatory, or you have to know who your customer is, number one, and that then helps you determine what are the hurdles to the sales cycle of that customer, right? If your solution is a platform solution where you got to talk to the Sutters and the Kaisers and all of that, you better very damn well have the right connections and the right strategic investors and partners to get you into the appropriate people, because that's going to be a slog that could take a year or two to get in there. And in some cases, it might be 6 months of a beta, which you make no money. And then they just say, oh yeah, well, it's nice, but we don't really love this product. So, you've just spent a huge amount of capital trying to get that deal, and it doesn't work. But I think the other thing that I was going to say, and after you brought up a very valuable point, which clarified what I was talking about before, I wasn't trying to insinuate that a lot of these companies that are out there who need to go and commercialize internationally, that you just flip the switch and say, hey, yeah, I'm going to just, market this in India, or I'm going to go market this in the Middle East. To me, that's the biggest value for us about our network, right? Because I can then say, okay, look, I want you to go to this place in India, and here's the connection to the chief medical officer and the chief financial officer. And by the way, 4 of our other portfolio companies are already in the door there, so we can get you in front of the right person. And if you're not going to be able to make the sale with that, with that application, then you're probably never going to make the sale to begin with, but it shortens that sales cycle and the effort and the amount of time to do that. So not any organization can do that unless you can bring that to the table. And that, because that's why we have the impact name in front of us, is that we're very focused. Yes, of course, we're focused on exit. We're focused on great returns, but we're also, it's very important to certainly the smaller fund investors, that we are bringing solutions to areas of the globe that don't have access or don't have access to these. And yes, maybe it's 10 cents on the dollar, but it's a way to deploy it. And we find that to be an advantage, especially when you've already deployed it in a 5-hospital system in Africa, and you're coming back to the US and now you have the FDA approval. That adds a lot of credibility to the solution. But you're absolutely right. It's not just flip of a switch. It's a lot of work to make that decision to consciously want to do that.
Yeah, and I certainly agree, and that's a huge value you offer there, Gary. I mean, I think the other piece of advice I like to give to the entrepreneurs beyond that initial, understand your payer, and then subsequently understand your customer. But to a large degree, in the healthcare sector, particularly digital health, you're selling often twice, right? You're selling to an administration inside of a system where their entire process, their entire value chain, so to speak, is very different. Then you're also selling and creating adoption with a clinician at some stage. And that is a very different model. And I think, entrepreneurs, especially if they're not coming out of deep in the industry, or if they don't have like a Gary on the board or something like that, who are really clinicians themselves, it's really a dual sale process, right? And, at the end of the day, you can get, buy-in from the, administration of a healthcare system, and the clinicians will never use it. You can get buy-in from the clinicians, and the healthcare system will never pay for it. So, this is a unique, sort of dance that a startup needs to do between the both parties, right? And it takes time. And, one of the points Gary made is it could be a couple of years. We've seen that, we were out with one of the great tele platforms, which is now, widely deployed under a different name. And it took years. We were in every major brand name, MD Anderson, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, Mount Sinai, every brand name facility and health system in the country, right? And we got the buy-in, it's there. And then it's a slog. I mean, it is trench warfare. It is clinician by clinician adoption at that level. So, what we like to see is less of I've got this great solution that's XYZ. When entrepreneurs come to us like that, we're like, okay, that's great. Show me what separates what we believe the winners from, the great solutions that are never going to go anywhere. Is show me how you're going to penetrate. The first time an entrepreneur comes in and says, here's my sales strategies for both sides of the house. This is for the administration. This is for the clinician. This is how I'm going to create adoption and push-pull and the right kind of model to get both of these people who hate each other naturally to actually talk to each other. Gary, how many clinicians love the administration inside a hospital system?
He's self-censored. He's not allowed to say.
Yeah, that's probably
I was muted. I said, is that a joke?
Exactly, right. So, I mean, you've got, two natural enemies that you actually have to bring together, in order to get your product into this life cycle. So what I look for in digital health is oftentimes what the entrepreneurs really don't have top of mind, which is what's your sales and marketing, what's your adoption strategy? Because, this comes all the way back to IT in its old days, right? Which is the best solution doesn't win. It's the solution that can get through all the gates that wins, right? And I think EHR et al. Is the greatest prover of that. EHR has been the biggest, messiest, craziest thing. And, really at the end of the day, a mobile entrepreneur could build something better than they have in, 3 weeks. But, you got what you got, right? And when you're penetrating, we're telling entrepreneurs, don't even say the word platform. Everything you should do plugs into an existing system, which increases value, increases functionality, generates more revenue, and all that. And very rarely do we see digital health entrepreneurs say, this will make you more money. If you start with that, and then a clinician says, this will also help, then you might have a hope of getting through the system.
Yep, that's the holy grail, basically. If you can accomplish that, I mean, our joke is, it's like with me, it's like you get an MBA when you're sitting in the doctor's lounge and you've gone to the dark side. Basically, they won't even let you have lunch in there because now you're on the administrative side of things. But there are places like Kaiser, which it depends. You got to know your system, and as I said, you got to know your customer. What Kaiser will do is, if you go to Kaiser Ventures for funding, they're going to do, and they're going to consider the funding, but then they're going to go to the administration and to the clinicians and say, I just have to do something here. Okay, the clinicians and say, is this worthwhile making an investment, and should we do a beta and test it? And let's trial it. And then if everyone loved it, then Ventures makes an investment and the admin then blesses it. And, because there are different components as to how they can benefit from that. But that's a rarity, as you say. Most organizations, you're much better off trying to get in there. If you got a return on investment and you can save money or make money, then go to the clinicians if you've got a good platform. that again, it's the whole grail, but that's a rarity these days. We could talk about Epic, but the thing about that is, again, from a purely business, forget about healthcare, what's the best business? Something that's mandatory, right? There's no choice. You have to have it. And when Epic and Cerner started, the government made an EHR mandatory, and there were 2 or 3 options. So of course those companies got first mover value, status, but that was a rare opportunity. So it's hard to use that as an example.
So if I can just jump in real quick, because I want to zoom out, because I feel like this conversation in the last 10 or 15 minutes has been really important. And if you are a first-time entrepreneur and you've not raised capital, like go back, watch the last 10, 15 minutes or so with the framework of understanding, look, if I'm thinking about raising capital, especially from venture investors, it's about, those investors being able to not only support the technology, but also get a return, right? And a return comes from what you're going to, not just the technology, but who you're going to sell it to, your ability to sell it. And you got to be able to sell it to those investors that, yeah, this plan is executable and is going to be successful within the time frame. Any thoughts on that? Because you guys are.
Yeah, no, I think it's brilliant. I mean, so much over the last kind of go-go period of deploying capital was throwing things at the wall and seeing it would stick on the venture side to some degree. I think a lot of the venture funds, especially the very large ones, became a little less focused on, getting to that exit sooner or later. I think, when the IRRs tick down, when the competition, Gary brought this up earlier, I think Alex did as well. It's as an asset class, you got to remember, we are investors on behalf of others. And if we can't deliver a return level that bests the rest of the market, then we don't get the money. When interest rates are, sub 1%, your options are limited, right? And, when interest rates are 7% and, investor rate of return in venture is 7%, and, the chances of being wiped out are 0 with your money in a, insured, bank account versus venture, which has got a 90% plus failure rate, it's a very easy decision from the check writers to us. So you have to see how that pushes down upon us. And, the reason why I bring these things up to a digital health entrepreneur is, there's often a tendency for an entrepreneur to go at a solution first and then figure out how it fits into the ecosystem, all the way from the paying, the customer, and everything else. What I am positioning is that exercise is as or more important than just purely your solution, because in healthcare, build it and they will come does not exist. You have a very, very rigid system and you have to thread the needle between the pieces. And if you can't do that, it doesn't matter how great your solution is, unfortunately.
I think there's another element to it. I think over time in healthcare, the patient experience will be more of a factor as well, because patients are more and more concerned about understanding a lot more about their health, and they're more demanding over time, I would say, because a lot of them actually pay a lot of things out of pocket. The higher proportion of higher out of pocket will influence a little bit the way you should treat patients. And for example, in the 2 startups that we invested, we looked a lot through that lens as well. Are they actually delivering something that is really relevant for the patients? And if they also have the clinicians on board to serve the patients in that manner, right? Those were the 2 questions that, for example, in the 2 investments that we did, were crucial for us to take the decision to invest in those companies. For example, in one, they're serving through a platform, they're women that through a subscription service, they have a dedicated primary care physician available, always online for them. A lot of the things that they handle with the primary care physician is asynchronous through messaging. And because those women, most of the times, have more and more chronic diseases, they like to, discuss those diseases through messages first to see what kind of care they need, and then maybe go to a medical visit, go somewhere specialized to take care of that condition. I think those type of things, you're going to see a lot more because people want a better experience overall as well. I don't know if you guys feel that as well. It's something that will become more and more crucial over time.
I think it's really important, and and the reality of our life is F brought it up. At the end of the day, we're deploying capital for other people, okay? And it is, even with the word impact, you still have to have returns that are adequate returns for your investors, right? And the reason I bring that up, Alex, is believe me, again, we're a network of clinicians. God, we have looked at the market of, fee for service, self-pay. But if you look at that market overall, certainly in the US, the total addressable market is it growing? Yes, but it's still an extremely small market, okay? And there is a place for it. But in terms of trying to develop, if you're looking at an investment that's only focusing on that, and we do have a few, like they weren't big investments, we believed in it, so we put $500,000 in and let's see what happens here. Okay, it wasn't a $5 million investment. And, those companies over the last 5 years have grown organically. Let's leave it at that. Okay, have they provided a service? Absolutely. But what they'll end up being, what's going to end up happening with those companies is they're going to get acquired by a bigger entity who understands that they need to be in that market, but it's not a market that you're going to survive on as an individual company. The other part of it is also, and you brought up a valid point, right? To me, at the end of the day, if you put the money aside, what's the most important thing that we should be addressing here? It's the patient-provider interaction, right? And how we provide care to a patient. And how do we provide care to a patient moving forward, as I mentioned, as Ep mentioned, precisionally, okay, in a precision mode, right? Because we're finding with all the data that we have now and how we're utilizing it, that if you're an oncology patient and you have a cancer, but you have this genomic and phenomic profile, that a certain percentage of those patients are going to have a 95% response rate to a certain therapy, and others are going to have a 10%. And if we can identify that early, again, holy grail, future of healthcare in terms of outcomes, in terms of cost of healthcare provision, but we're probably 10, 15 years away from that, right? So there are companies that are deploying that, but it's going to take time and it's a slog and it's going to be a lot more money put into before you're ever going to really generate a lot of revenue there. And it's those kind of solutions which do accomplish what we just talked about, but how do you monetize some of that in a way to make sense from an investment standpoint? Perhaps those should be the ones that are funded by the Gates Foundation and funded by those foundational or government entities that maybe, I won't say are, but may be incentivized to go down that direction. And you can accomplish that. But if we're talking sitting here as a group of venture capitalists and looking at what markets we can invest in, I personally believe that you got to be really careful about going down those directions when you have to answer to a bunch of investors that are looking for a return. And again, this is coming from a doctor, right? I have to take my medical hat off and have to put my VC hat on or my entrepreneur hat on. And you can't just say across the board that you can treat those the same, because you can't. So you have to pick those that can accomplish much of that, but there are few and far between, and the idea is to identify those and put your money in those. But the question is, how do you identify those winners moving forward?
I don't want to cut the conversation off, but I do want to at least take a pause and say, we've reached the hour. I want to encourage folks, if they've got questions, to use the Q&A function and submit your questions so that we can start taking some of those. We'll answer those that have sort of the most general applicability, and to the extent that maybe a question doesn't, we'll try and broaden it out and make it generally applicable.
Yeah, and I think Gary just answered the first Q&A question there.
Yeah,
data, so it was perfect.
In terms of we're focusing on the data, what kind of data are we talking about? Well, both.
That's
You
right.
brought up informatics earlier as well. I think we can flesh that out a little bit. a little bit further in terms of, yeah.
I mean, Gary's right on track. I mean, the biggest issue is who's going to pay for it. And Gary was like spot on that who's going to ultimately pay for it. I mean, we found that you actually have to bundle that with the diagnostic side, because diagnostic you can get paid for because that's a known payment entity. There's a reimbursement code for that in the US, and you can get very, very pricey in terms of diagnostics, right? Now, informatic diagnostics doesn't have so much of a payment code, and that oftentimes is, oh, that's the greatest, most helpful data ever. Thank you so much. And I'm not going to pay you for it because there's no mechanism. So, there's a lot of, sort of modeling, and thought that an entrepreneur has to do in order to, to look into that. I mean, we saw one of the most exciting startups a few years back that was going back and looking at, therapeutics that were particularly, off patent, were now into the generic bucket, had lost favor oftentimes with clinicians, and had gone into therapeutic, basically, Medicare medication, purgatory there. And they were finding interesting combinations of, old school antibiotics in combinations with antihistamines. And in particular, they happened to find a blend of the two that was effective at potentially treating Lyme disease, which is one of the hardest things out there because there's a particular shell around the blah, 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 blah. So you need the antihistamine to reduce the shell. Then you got to get then you have to deliver, an antibiotic, and it has to have a certain profile. So, that stuff's great. The question is, who's going to pay for it, right? And it looks like they're going to end up becoming a tool for big pharma much more than a clinician or a patient, which is totally sad, because at the end of the day, the patient is looking for hope, but it's going to end up being a big pharma. We've got to go solve Lyme disease. Here's our 10 internal contenders for that. Let's run this through the external database and see if there's anything out there we're missing, right? So, and now you've got 12 customers in the world, and you better hope they pay you a couple $1 million a year, so now you're working on all kinds of models. So it's tough. So, again, like I was saying earlier, and I think my colleagues have really backed it up, make sure you fit into a payment code, make sure there's a way for you to get paid. Then you've got to make sure to get a way for the clinician to adopt you. And, ideally, when those two are done, you actually deliver a solution that's patient friendly and valuable to their outcomes, So it is the holy grail, but that's our job. Our job here in venture is that, it became a little more of a spray and pray model here for a long time in venture. And I think with, the current economy, it's like, okay, wait, we are the guys that and gals that deliver the holy grail. Our job is to spot the holy grail and, invest in that early on, right? And it's becoming more and more prevalent when the return levels that we've delivered are now going to be fine-tooth combed.
Alex, I didn't know if you had I don't know if you have any thoughts or you wanted to chime in.
On this question,
Yeah.
maybe I could take the one related to challenges that
A foreign health tech startup. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, maybe, I think first you have to analyze what kind of a regulatory framework your solution might be affected by in the US. And of course, do a proper market scan if what you guys are developing is already handled here or not in the US. But I would say that the main challenge first is to understand what kind of regulation should I comply with if I want to come to the US, and then which are the type of partners I need to actually commercially put myself out there, right? And of course do a lot of homework before regarding what kind of competition I might have entering the market or not, right?
But I think that makes perfect sense to me. Hopefully the audience member found that helpful. Does anyone in the room do you play in the insurance space at all, or following sort of, there's a question about and I presume this is a US focused question, because we still have health insurance here as opposed to a national system. But in terms of any developments, in terms of changes to PPOs, maybe Medicare Advantage to those folks who are interested in Medicare Advantage plans, and does anyone focus or play in that space?
Well, I mean, what I'll say is, I'll take a step back from that and answer it in a different way.
Great.
I
Okay.
mean, because I think that question is really asking, how do you see the future of reimbursement, and who's going to be really interested in or have the incentives aligned in the reimbursement system in healthcare moving forward? And I God knows if I'm right or wrong, but the trends that I see happening right now, I believe, are moving in a direction where the control of healthcare is going to start to sit on the side of the employers, not necessarily insurers. Are the insurers going to disappear tomorrow? No. But I think the organizations, and the governments, of course, I mean, the organizations that are most incentivized to improve healthcare, to make it more efficient, and to keep employees / patients healthy are the ones paying for the care, right? Now, on the other side of it, if there's no employer and there's Medicare or, there's Medi-Cal, it would be on the government side of it. And we clearly have seen the forces of nature on those ends and how they will intervene in healthcare, probably not necessarily very efficiently or effectively sometimes, but they at least have the power to do it. So I truly believe that the future of healthcare is going to sit on the side of the employers. And ultimately, I believe that someone is going to come up with a model, right? And there are certainly lots of different models across the world for different types of reimbursement for healthcare, which is a hybrid model where the employers are really driving it in a way where it's more preventative, it's more screening, it's more precision, with the goal of keeping people at work, keeping people not out of work, employees, and also just improving the lives of their employees by improving healthcare through digital health and other advances in health. So at least that's, my Gary Goldman's 2 cents on the world. Whether that'll be true, I don't know, but it seems like the forces of nature are moving us in that direction.
Thank you, Gary. Let me ask this question, and maybe this one should be directed to F. In terms of solving or improving health outside of the needs, outside of the current sort of existing payment system, what opportunities do you see, or are there for entrepreneurs? Hint, maybe wellness.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and that's the right question actually of all the entrepreneurs should be asking, which is, you either choose to go at this in a frontal assault, in which case you have to be properly armed. By the way, I'm just going to throw this plug out there. Jason is a great guy to go to because there's a sort of a lobbyist component in the healthcare category, and I will just tell you, he has been great in the past, and law firms do that kind of stuff, and going at the system without all the proper pieces is just a fool's errand. But to that entrepreneur's point, there are private pay issues. There is consumer focused healthcare. There are folks that have made inroads there, and there's a value there. And, being able to get a consumer to pay for something is viable as long as the price is right and the value is there. And, to be frank with you, I would rather take my chances with the consumer these days than with the screwed up system, in a lot of different categories, right? We saw it with things like Doctors on Demand. We saw it with second opinion websites early on. Did they do their best job? I think you can learn enough from those to figure out where the value proposition is for the consumer. Also, the consumer has a lot of their own tech today, Apple Watches, smartphone devices, et cetera, et cetera. they're also, as we look at, and I've spent a lot of time at other global conferences, and I know Rob supports like Venture Summit and so on, where we've got a very broad swath of, and Gary and I are there, year after year, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff, and it's very global that's coming in there. And, there are a lot of categories like sleep. Sleep is a big category. Eyes are a big category, and those operate outside of the norm. Dental, vision, sleep, these are all things that live outside of the purview of the typical hospital system, right? The minute the word tooth is involved and it's not an ear, nose, and throat doctor problem, that's, they don't care at a hospital, right? I mean, this thing could be spurting blood and sorry, man, you got to go see your dentist after the fact, right? On the flip side of that, you can also look at vision, similar scenario, unless you walk into the emergency room with a nail in your eye, that's an outpatient ophthalmology, God knows their, Target is doing appointments and glass fitting and stuff like that. So there's a lot of other opportunities there when you start looking at that broader picture, as an entrepreneur. Now, if you've already got a solution and it has to be delivered in those environments, then you have no choice. Then you have to be smart and figure out all these other pieces. But if you've got a great solution that matters to the ultimate end patient, and you can make it cheap enough that they're willing to pay for it, well, then that's great. I mean, I'd love to see second opinion websites that are small, fast enough, and are not, liability fear, that when you're sitting in a hospital bed and a hospitalist that's just seen their 100th patient of the day and is shooting from the hip, you've got someone on the other side of the phone to do that. And, those of us, who have had the opportunity with, I've had ill parents and I've had consulting physicians and blah, 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 blah. There's nothing like having the former head of gerontology at Stanford to inform the care of, your patient in a hospital setting, even if they don't have privileges, because they'll talk to a hospitalist and says, I know this patient, I'm a specialist. I think you should do X, Y, and Z. If you can collapse that cycle and democratize that, that's really exciting. And what we like to see is the democratization of healthcare, making it so the have-nots get the benefit that the haves have. In a lot of cases, you can do so effectively. So those are the things we like to look at. But if you run at a frontal assault and, you don't have a lot of air cover, it's going to be a bloodbath.
I think that also brings up a concept that we spend a lot of time focusing in on when we are looking at investments, is the synergies of those investments, right? Because you can do that in healthcare. And one of the problems in healthcare that we've experienced with EH, we're experiencing now with telehealth and just in general, is healthcare is very siloed, as per what F was talking about, right? Now, that doesn't mean that the silos aren't important. As a matter of fact, there are many silos that are ignored because of just the nature of which they are. And those were great examples, F. Being a dentist, I really love those dental analogies. So for us, we're constantly trying to identify specialty or profession specialty specific solutions, with the idea that the ultimate solution doesn't necessarily mean that that particular solution is the is the global solution for healthcare, but it becomes the focused, siloed solution that can integrate with the more general platform solutions, so that we have an integration of platforms that are specific to the encounter, right? There's no reason that an obstetrician should be expected to use the same solution as an orthopedic surgeon. I'm sorry, and that's where we are right now with telehealth.
That was a really weird analogy, Gary. It was super funny.
Was.
If you're an insider, man, that was Seinfeld quality humor, by the way.
I know that, believe me, because I'm the guy on the other side of the ether screen working with those guys, right? It's the difference between a mechanic and, whatever. So the bottom line is that I believe that that's a future of healthcare, and that becomes very relevant from a capitalist perspective, because where do we deploy our capital and what are we trying to do to improve care? And then the last part that I'll add on to what F said is very true. One of the great things about digital health, which has not been accomplishable or easily accomplished by healthcare in general, is to take these solutions that are being developed that are physical and face to face and take them from New York City to, Cochin, India, or to a little village in East Africa. Whereas the deployment of digital health, which is not, again, it has to be hybrid, but with second opinion network, advocacy networks, support networks for clinicians that don't have the same experience, that can be deployed on this little device here, the phone, right? And that's what digital health is accomplishing. And there's no reason that these companies that are being successful in digital health, as you said, they may be making a ton load of money in the American market, but that should also be used to foster improved care and access in places where they can't afford it, because that is the impact future of healthcare. It should not make a difference where the geographic, any one of those dots on the globe behind me shouldn't make a difference where it is. They should have access to it, but there should be a way that we can take advantage of it economically and from an entrepreneurial perspective, but still accomplish that at the same time. And I think Alex was kind of alluding to that earlier.
Yeah, and maybe to add to what you just said, there are several studies already pointing to one thing, that the younger generations, 80% of them are already browsing online and talking online about health issues, right? So they're actually seeking for information, sharing information online about this. That's why more and more now, these type of plays that can actually help people, have the right degree of information, the correct information, and the right degree of access to people that could help them are more and more relevant. I totally agree with what you just said.
Thank you. So I'm going to sort of declare that as an answer to this question about whether or not telehealth and digital health can basically expand or leverage the number of doctors or nurses that are available. Because I think it sounds like there's a lot of appetite for the democratization of these technologies and support for that. And then I'm going to ask maybe one final question of Alex, because I want to leave enough time so that each of you can sort of share any parting thoughts you have, as well as your contact information. But there's a question that is of general applicability. It's focused sort of on the split of existing stockholders, but I want to actually zoom out and make that question more along the lines of, when assessing a team in which you're going to make an investment, sort of what are the factors that you look at for those team members?
Yeah, so I love this one. Try not to invest in clinicians is my number one data point in the healthcare field. Now, Gary, because just Gary does everything, and I don't actually think he sleeps, is a rare example. But I think it's a blend, right? And a clinician only team is a non-starter for us. We've been there, done that, paid the price. A non-healthcare experienced team, IT folks trying to break into healthcare, been there, done that. That doesn't work either. And then, so just like we apply just about every other, model, we like to see, in a perfect world, 2 or 3 co-founders, ideally 3 in our opinion. One is, the scientific technical co-founder, one is the management co-founder, and one is the sales business development, came with the Rolodex co-founder. We like to see a model where often the initial founder, who might be technical, or the business people that have, acquired those pieces, have been able to convince, we call it the Moses or Joan of Arc factor. Can you convince people who, are vice presidents of big companies to take a risk and jump out of their high-paying careers to go to a startup, right? We're looking for those things, the magnetism of the entrepreneur, as well as being able to have that level of, inter-industry expertise. A startup that comes to us with a solution without someone from inside the industry, it's just really a non-starter. If they come back with the former vice president of Merck, maybe we'll have that conversation. But, in a lot of cases, we're moving so quickly through the cycles, we're not going to entertain that first meeting and give them that advice and, take another meeting when they come back. So take the advice now, which is have a broad-based team, make sure you're in a position to check as many boxes when you walk in the door to the venture folks, and make sure you're aligning who you're talking to. Look at what we're looking at in terms of our baseline. Go spend time at an incubator, go spend time with people like Gary, who can wrap a nice warm blanket of support around you before you get into folks like us who are going to ask a lot harder questions.
Maybe just to add, I think, one thing that you already touched on is complementing skills within the team. That's really, crucial in table stakes. I think having a good pool of credible advisors in several areas that are relevant for the company is also a plus. And then, the icing on the cake is if they're a repeat founder that already did, a company in the space or a similar space, right? In healthcare in general, I think that, is the icing on the cake, I would say. But of course, the first-time founders don't like to hear that, but that's something that goes without saying as well.
Right. And that's a good point, Alex. And what I would add to that is that's the Moses or Joan of Arc factor, which is go recruit someone who's had an exit. Maybe they weren't in the front row, the second row. They took some money off the table. That makes them hungrier than anybody else because they've seen, the promised land, so to speak, and convince them to join your team. I mean, to us, honestly, we like entrepreneurs that have got those folks on board as much as we like entrepreneurs that have exited the first time, right? Because entrepreneurs that exit the first time, oftentimes, think they know what they're doing and this is their, and they're a little bit harder to get your, advisors and everybody else to change. Whereas the entrepreneur that can convince a bunch of people that have had an exit to get on their team for the next round is golden for us.
I agree.
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, as F said, we tend to deal with those difficult to deal with physician and or clinician first-time innovators or entrepreneurs. Now, some of them, per what Alex was saying, are have had successes before, and then at that point, I'm not thinking of them as a clinician. I'm thinking of them more as an entrepreneur, and many of them have MBAs. But I think in terms of the ideal team, probably from my perspective, if you're going down that path, you have to really understand and get to know the entrepreneur, okay? Especially if they're a clinician, because there are certain characteristics that they need to have, not necessarily inherent in a typical clinician. The openness to listen to advice, the openness to understand that you might not know everything, and the understanding of creating a management team that is synergistic with what you bring to the table, but also brings those qualities that are necessary to get you to the simple next milestone, right? If you're very early and you don't have an MVP, that's a different need than if you're someone who's developed a product or a device who now has an MVP, but now needs to get to the next step. Okay. And we encourage many of them to go through an innovation hub or an accelerator. And we do have those within our organization because that helps them get the feedback like this. I mean, you guys know that, there's Max Shapiro, and Max runs Pitch Force, and you get in front of a bunch of us and you have to listen to your pitch and you have to listen to your company and take the critique about, if you want to get to the next step, this is what you need to accomplish. So I think it depends on the maturation of the company in terms of addressing that concept. But I tend to live in a world where I'm pretty focused on those type of entrepreneurs, whereas I know, you guys are looking at more mature companies a lot of times, and it's a different analysis, and the questions become a lot different at that stage.
Terrific. Well, that is our time for today. We'll let Gary get the last word, but I want to thank each of the panelists: Alex Santos, who's co-founder and general partner of Chamaeleon; Ephraim Lindenbaum, who is the managing director of Advanced Ventures; and Gary Goldman, who is the managing partner at Global Health Impact Fund, and also the network. I'm Jason Putnam Gordon. I want to thank K&L Gates for organizing, as well as Idea to IPO for organizing. I'm also going to give a quick plug for the beta version of Venture Capital Training Camp. With that, I'm going to let each of you get back to building your great companies. Have a great day. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. Great show, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jason.
See ya.
Great call.
Yeah, good call. It was fun.